All right, let's get right into it. For centuries, the ancient world was dominated by two absolute superpowers, Rome and Persia. And the rivalry? Well, it was one of the longest and most brutal in all of human history. Which brings up a really fascinating question. We are talking about a conflict that raged on for nearly 700 years. Think about that. Entire generations were born, lived their whole lives, and died, all while these two empires were locked in this seemingly endless fight. It's truly one of the longest feuds we've ever seen. And that's the real puzzle, isn't it? We think of Rome as this unstoppable force. They conquered Gauls, Greeks, Egyptians, pretty much everyone they came up against. They built this colossal empire, stretching from the shores of Britain to the deserts of the Levant. So why did this incredible war machine just stop when it got to Persia? Some of Rome's greatest leaders, the most famous names in the history books, they threw everything they had at Persia and failed, sometimes spectacularly. So the answer isn't something simple like, a few bad battles or a string of incompetent generals. Nope. To really get this, we have to completely rethink something we take for granted. The very first thing you have to do is just completely erase the idea of a border as a nice, clean line on a map. That's how we think. But for the Romans and for pretty much everyone in the ancient world, that concept just didn't exist. So to figure out why this massive frontier settled where it did, we first have to ask, what even was a border to the people who actually lived there? And lucky for us, the Romans had a very specific word for it. They called their frontiers the limites. And this is absolutely crucial. These weren't walls, they weren't fences. They were huge, porous zones of influence. Think of them more like a frontier region, where people and goods and ideas were just constantly flowing back and forth. And this isn't just a theory. We have an ancient writer, Procopius, who gives us this amazing, vivid picture of what everyday life was like. He talks about Roman landowners and their workers just casually crossing from Roman territory to Persian territory and back again. It was a totally blended world, not a divided one. Okay, so if the frontier wasn't a military line held by legions, what was it? Well, the true limits of Roman power weren't drawn by swords and shields. They were dictated by something far more fundamental and almost invisible: logistics. This chart basically shows you the secret engine of Roman expansion. Wherever there was a major river, like the Rhine or the Danube or the Nile, it was like an ancient superhighway. They could move troops and supplies fast, cheap, and reliably. But the second you had to move over land, everything changed. The whole imperial machine just grinds to a halt. It becomes slow, incredibly expensive, and super dangerous. A historian named C.R. Whitaker came up with this brilliant theory to explain this, which he called the periphery. And his big idea was that an empire doesn't just stop. Its power gradually fades with distance, and that distance is determined entirely by how far its logistical and economic engine can actually reach. Whitaker breaks it down into two zones. First, you have the inner frontier. This is the stuff Rome could actually own, tax, and control directly because it was easy to supply. But beyond that, you had this huge outer frontier. This was a zone where Rome could project its power. They could raid, they could intimidate, they could make alliances, but they could never, ever hold on to it for long. It was just too far from a river, too expensive to keep an army there permanently. Now, that's a great theory, right? But let's put it to the test with a real-world example. Let's look at Emperor Trajan's massive invasion of Persia. If anyone in Roman history could have finally broken the stalemate and conquered Persia, it was this guy. And on paper, his campaign was an absolutely stunning success. He marches his legions all the way down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He captures the enemy capital city, Ctesiphon. He even stands on the shores of the Persian Gulf. It looked like the final, ultimate victory. But then, just 1 year later, the whole thing completely collapses. So what happened? How did this moment of absolute triumph suddenly turn into a desperate, chaotic retreat? The answer to this question is really the key to understanding the entire 700-year war. Here's the thing. Trajan wasn't defeated by a bigger, better Persian army. No. In a way, he was defeated by his own success. He had pushed the Roman logistical machine way past its breaking point. The sheer economic cost of trying to occupy all this new territory, it was just impossible. And let's put a number on that, because it's pretty staggering. Historians figure that the cost of just one of these major campaigns could be as high as 125% of the entire annual revenue of the Parthian state. Even for a superpower like Rome, projecting force that far from home was just ruinously expensive. And that's the real paradox here. Yeah, Rome's economy was way, way bigger than Parthia's. It wasn't even close. But even that incredible economic power had a physical limit. It's like having the world's most powerful engine in your car, but you've only got a tiny little gas tank. Eventually, no matter how powerful you are, you just run out of fuel.
So, when you start putting all these pieces together, the fluid borders, the limits of logistics, the insane economics, a whole new picture starts to emerge. This wasn't a story of a failed war. It was a stalemate, and it was a stalemate born from cold, hard reality.
So a final, decisive victory was just never in the cards, and for a few key reasons. For one, Parthia wasn't centralized like Rome. Capturing its capital was a big deal, sure, but it didn't end the war. Then there's the geography. The lands beyond the rivers, especially the Zagros Mountains, an absolute logistical nightmare. And at the end of the day, both empires were pushing right up against the absolute physical limits of what they could supply and control. The 700-year war, then, wasn't really a story of Roman failure at all. It was the story of two massive empires slowly and bloodily finding their natural balancing point, a line drawn not by generals with maps, but by geography, by economics, and by the unforgiving math of logistics.
And that kind of leaves us with a big thought for today, doesn't it? The Romans were limited by rivers and mountains. It makes you wonder, in our hyper-connected, globalized world, what are the invisible frontiers, the economic ones, the cultural ones, the technological ones, that still define the true limits of power?